Hey there to all you philosophy fans out there. Today we're going to really get into something that I think will, I don't know, really kind of click with you all. We're going to be looking at Pythagoreanism.
A topic that's, uh, gosh, it's been around for so long. It's amazing how long people have been thinking about this.
Exactly.
Yeah,
And I think for you, as someone who, follows philosophy and really gets into it, you probably know a bit about Pythagoras. I mean, come on, who hasn't heard of the Pythagorean theorem,
right,
right?
right.
But we're going to go way beyond that today. We're going to dive deep, and I mean deep, into Pythagoreanism through history. It's going to be fascinating, I promise. And to do that, we've got some great material here from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy.
Yeah, some really good stuff.
Yeah, real in-depth, scholarly stuff.
Yeah.
And what we're going to try to do today is, well, figure out what exactly is Pythagoreanism. I mean, it's taken so many forms over the centuries.
So many.
Right. And also, why is it still important? Why does it still matter today?
Why should we care?
Right. So to start, maybe we should get back to basics. I mean, how did Pythagoreanism even begin?
Good place to start.
Yeah. So basically, the earliest Pythagoreanism was, well, all about Pythagoras himself, right?
Yeah.
Back in like the 6th century BCE.
Yeah.
And for him, it was all about his philosophy and, how to live your life.
Okay. Kind of like an ethical system.
Yeah, exactly. Ethics and philosophy all mixed together. And a really big part of that was the idea of metempsychosis.
Metempsychosis.
Yeah, I always have trouble with that word. But it basically means the soul moves from one body to another after death.
Oh, reincarnation.
Right, reincarnate. It's like, a cosmic recycling program for your consciousness. You know what I mean?
I like that. So then how did it change from there?
Well, that's where it gets really interesting. By the 5th and 4th centuries BCE, we start seeing people who are called, what did Aristotle call them? The so-called Pythagoreans.
Yeah, so-called.
Yeah.
That's important.
Yeah, and for you, thinking about how ideas change over time, that so-called is really key. Because both Plato and Aristotle, they weren't totally sure if these people were really connected to Pythagoras' original teachings.
It's like, imagine trying to figure out what a song originally sounded like, but you've only heard versions from hundreds of years later, with all kinds of changes and additions.
That's a great analogy.
And on top of that, Aristotle rarely even names these so-called Pythagoreans. Makes it even harder to figure out what was going on back then.
Yeah, it's a real puzzle. But even though he's kind of vague about who they were, Aristotle does describe their philosophy. And get this, it sounds a lot like the writings of Philolaus of Croton.
Philolaus.
Yeah. He was around in the mid-5th century BCE, and he seems to have been a pretty big deal. His main idea, well, one of them at least, was that everything in the universe is controlled by these two forces: limiters and unlimiteds.
Limiters and unlimiteds. Interesting.
Yeah. So limiters, those are like the boundaries, the things that define things. And unlimiteds, well, they're the opposite. They're the things that are, boundless, kind of formless. And Philolaus thought that number was the key to understanding how these two forces work together to make the universe we see.
So instead of just talking about what stuff is made of, he's talking about the structure of reality and using math to understand it. That's a pretty big change for that time, wouldn't you say?
Oh, absolutely. Totally revolutionary. Then there was this other guy, Eurydice. People think he was probably Philolaus' student, so he was continuing on with this idea of numbers and the cosmos. But, we don't have a lot of his own writings, sadly.
Oh, that's too bad.
Yeah, so we don't know as much about him. Then a bit later, we have Archytas in the 4th century BCE. Now, Archytas, he was a big deal, and even Plato recognized how important he was. Archytas was all about figuring out the mathematical structure of music, and he's actually considered the first really important mathematician in the whole Pythagorean tradition.
Yeah, I've heard of him. He took Philolaus' ideas and developed them even further using mathematical proportions, right?
Exactly. Like, the idea that music is basically math, I mean, that's a pretty profound thought, right? Connecting those two things together.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
And that idea of finding mathematical harmony in everything, that's really at the heart of Pythagoreanism, isn't it?
Absolutely. Now, remember how Aristotle was all careful with his so-called Pythagoreans?
Yes. I'm still thinking about that.
Well, it gets even more interesting when we look at what he thought about Pythagoras himself. Seems like Aristotle didn't really see him as a cosmologist, someone who theorized about the universe. He thought Pythagoras was more of a, I don't know, like a spiritual leader.
Really?
Yeah, who started a whole way of life, someone known for like doing amazing things, almost supernatural stuff.
Interesting. So he was more of a religious figure for Aristotle.
Yeah, something like that. And some scholars even debate that, maybe Aristotle got it wrong. But you can see why he was hesitant to connect Pythagoras with these later thinkers. I mean, there are so many different stories about Pythagoras floating around.
So many different versions.
Yeah,
That
makes
makes
it hard to separate fact from fiction, right? Oh, and I almost forgot. We have to talk about the table of opposites. That's another thing these so-called Pythagoreans came up with. It's this system where they list all these opposite pairs, like limit and unlimited, odd and even, one and many. It's like they were trying to, categorize everything in the universe according to these basic
a
dualities.
way of making sense of the world.
Yeah, exactly. So you've got Pythagoras, then these so-called Pythagoreans all into numbers and the cosmos and then the table of opposites. But here's the thing, and I think for you, as someone who studies history, this is going to be fascinating. It's actually really hard to say who was a Pythagorean back then. I mean, how do we know for sure?
Yeah, drawing those lines is always tricky.
Right. And then you have this guy, Iamblichus, writing in the 4th century CE, centuries later. He writes a book called On the Pythagorean Life, and he has this huge list of supposedly 235 Pythagoreans. 235. And get this, 17 of them are women.
Wow, that's a long list. But how accurate can that be hundreds of years later?
Well, that's the thing. More than half of them, like 145, their names don't appear anywhere else. So it makes you wonder, was Iamblichus maybe being a little too generous with who he considered a Pythagorean?
Yeah, maybe just a tad.
Some people think that Iamblichus was using an older list by Aristoxenus, who was around in the 4th century BCE, so much closer to the source.
That would make more sense, being closer to the actual time.
Exactly. Plus, Aristoxenus actually knew some of these people. But even with that, there are some problems. Like Philolaus and Eurydice, they're listed under Tarentum, which makes sense based on other things Aristoxenus wrote. But then Xenophilus, who was Aristoxenus' teacher, he's listed under Cyzicus. And that doesn't match up with what Aristoxenus himself said.
So some things line up, some things don't.
Right. And then there's this guy, Boris. He was like a mythical figure, kind of like a magician. It seems weird for Aristoxenus, who was a pretty rational guy, to include someone like that.
Yeah, that doesn't sound like him.
So maybe Aristoxenus did make a list, but it got changed and added to over the years. And then for you, thinking about who belongs to a particular school of thought, this is key. Iamblichus includes people like Alcmaeon, Empedocles, even Parmenides and Melissus. But were they really Pythagoreans?
That's the big question. Like Alcmaeon, Aristotle said specifically that he wasn't a Pythagorean. And Empedocles, sure, he had some Pythagorean ideas like reincarnation and not eating meat, but he developed his own whole philosophy too.
And Parmenides, his only connection is that his teacher was supposedly a Pythagorean, but that doesn't automatically make him one, right? And Melissus, well, he was Parmenides' student. It's like saying that if your professor went to a talk by, I don't know, Nietzsche, then you must be a Nietzschean.
Exactly. It's way too simplistic. There's this scholar, Leonid's Mood, and he thinks we should take a different approach. He says we should start with the people on Aristoxenus' list and then try to figure out what they believed based on what we know they did.
Makes sense.
Right, like what were their interests? What kind of work did they do? So he points to people like Demonides, who was a doctor, and Alcmaeon, who was interested in medicine and nature. He says this shows that early Pythagoreanism wasn't just about math, but all sorts of things. He even uses this idea from Wittgenstein, the family resemblance. Like maybe there wasn't a strict set of rules, but more like a bunch of overlapping similarities between these people.
So kind of like a network of ideas rather than a rigid doctrine.
Exactly.
That's really interesting. But our source does say that this approach has problems too. Like, it still includes Alcmaeon, who Aristotle said wasn't a Pythagorean. And there's another guy, Menestor, who we just don't know enough about. So relying on this list alone might not be the best way to figure out who was a Pythagorean and who wasn't.
Right. It's not a foolproof method.
Yeah. So maybe we need to go back to what they actually believed. Like if someone believed in all the stuff Aristotle says the Pythagoreans believed in, limiters and unlimiteds, the counter-earth, the central fire, then maybe we can say they were a Pythagorean.
That makes sense. But we do have to be careful. Just because someone was a mathematician back then doesn't automatically make them a Pythagorean.
Oh, yeah, good point. I mean, the Greeks loved math.
Yeah. Like Theodorus or Hippocrates, they were great mathematicians. But
Yeah.
we don't really know if they were actually part of the Pythagorean group.
Okay, so figuring out who was a Pythagorean is tough. Now, what about Orphism? How does that fit in?
Ah, yes, the connection with Orphism. That's a bit of a mystery itself, isn't it?
Total mystery. So later on, most people thought that Pythagoras was initiated into the Orphic mysteries, and that Orphism really influenced him.
Okay.
But some earlier accounts actually say that Pythagoras wrote some of the Orphic texts. I mean, can you imagine? The problem is, it's really hard to define either Pythagoreanism or Orphism clearly, especially in their early stages.
It's like trying to nail down, I don't know, a cloud.
Right. And then you have these really obscure figures like Brontinus and Cercops. Supposedly they were Pythagoreans who wrote Orphic texts. And then there's Patron, who came up with this crazy idea of 183 worlds arranged in a triangle.
183 worlds in a triangle.
Yeah, wild, right? But most scholars think he was probably just a literary figure, not a real Pythagorean.
Makes sense.
And then there's Parmeniscus. He's got this story about how he lost his ability to laugh, but then he went to this cave, the cave of Trophonius, and got it back. And that's somehow connected to being a Pythagorean.
A cave that cures you of not laughing.
I know, right? Strange. But it does show you that there were all these different beliefs and practices associated with Pythagoreanism, even if we don't always know exactly what they meant.
Yeah, these little glimpses are fascinating, even if they don't give us the full picture.
Absolutely. Now, let's move on to a pretty big split within Pythagoreanism. We're talking about the akismaticiai and the mathematiciai.
Yes, a philosophical showdown.
Right. And right at the center of it is this guy, Hippasus. He was probably from Metapontum, though the stories aren't all clear on that. But basically, he's the one who's blamed for starting all this mathematical and scientific inquiry within Pythagoreanism. Kind of a rebel, you know?
So he's the one who caused the rift. What were the main differences between these two groups?
Okay, so the Aximatici, they were all about following the akismata, which means things heard. These were like the oral teachings and rules of Pythagoras, like what to eat, what not to do, all sorts of taboos. The Mathematici, on the other hand, they were focused on math and the natural world. They thought that was the way to really understand the universe.
Two very different approaches. How did they view each other?
Well, the Akismatici basically thought the Mathematici weren't real Pythagoreans. They said all this math and science stuff came from Hippasus, and he wasn't a true follower of Pythagoras.
So they saw him as corrupting the original teachings.
Yeah, something like that. The Mathematici, though, they thought they were the ones who really understood the deep stuff. Like, they said that when Pythagoras first came to Italy, he gave the basic oral teachings to the busy folks who didn't have time for anything else. But then the younger, more free people, they got to learn all the math and proofs. So the Akismatici were stuck with the basic stuff, while the Mathematici were the real intellectuals, you know. And poor Hippasus, he ended up getting rejected by both sides.
Wow, talk about being caught in the crossfire. Were there other important figures around this time, besides these two main groups?
Yeah, there were a few. Like Amenius, he was Parmenides' teacher, and Iccus of Tarentum, an athlete who was known for living a really simple life. Though the early sources don't actually say he was a Pythagorean.
Right.
Then there's Epicharmus. He was a comic poet from Sicily. And some people later on said he was a Pythagorean because he used numbers in his plays. But we don't really have any proof of that from back then.
It seems like later on, people were really eager to claim anyone famous as a Pythagorean.
Oh, totally. And then there were Lysis and Archippus. They were the ones who survived that terrible fire in Croton, you know, where a lot of Pythagoreans died.
Oh, yeah, I remember that.
So Lysis went on to become the teacher of Epaminondas, who was this famous Theban general. And that makes some people think Lysis was probably an Akismaticus because of, you know, the focus on ethics and how to live your life. There's even this letter that people say he wrote all about how important it is to keep Pythagorean teachings secret.
A secret society.
Right. But, you know, scholars think that letter was probably a fake. Then there's Thymaridus. He came up with this mathematical method called the bloom, but we don't know exactly when he lived or if he was really connected to the early Pythagoreans. There are all these later writings that mention him, but those aren't always reliable.
Okay, so lots of interesting characters, but still lots of uncertainty about who was really a Pythagorean and what they believed.
Yeah. And it seems like things started to change in the 4th century BCE, maybe even a decline in, I don't know, how active the Pythagoreans were. It's like they were fading away a bit.
Yeah, it does seem like a transitional period, but this is where Aristoxenus comes in. He was around in the late 4th century BCE. He was a music theorist and part of Aristotle's Lyceum, but he'd also been a Pythagorean earlier on.
So he had an inside view.
Exactly. He wrote a lot about Pythagoreanism, though most of it's lost now. But what we do have is really valuable because he wasn't as influenced by later interpretations, like the ones coming from Plato's Academy. He knew the earlier tradition firsthand.
That's so important for trying to understand the original Pythagoreans.
Right. He even wrote a book called Pythagorean Precepts. It was all about the ethical rules the Pythagoreans followed. Gives us a glimpse into their moral system. though some scholars think he might have mixed in some ideas from Plato and Aristotle, too.
It's so hard to separate all these influences, isn't it?
It really is.
Yeah.
And around this time, we also have people like Milius of Croton and his wife Tamika. There's this great story about how brave and loyal they were, which probably reflects that akismaticity emphasis on ethics. And then there's Diodorus of Aspendus, who was a vegetarian and wore some pretty strange clothes. He was even accused of pretending to be a Pythagorean to make himself look good.
Wow.
Modern scholars mostly think he was a legitimate akismaticus, just a little bit eccentric maybe, but it shows you how much variety there was within Pythagoreanism and how hard it is to define exactly what it meant to be one.
Yeah, lots of different ways of living the Pythagorean life, but after Aristoxenus, it gets a lot harder to find people who we can clearly identify as Pythagoreans. It's like they disappeared for a while.
Yeah, there's a bit of a gap there.
Which brings us to Plato. And I think for a lot of philosophers, this is where things get really interesting. What was his relationship to Pythagoreanism?
That's a big question, and there's no easy answer. Some people, especially later on, actually thought Plato was basically a Pythagorean himself, just without officially calling himself one.
Really?
Yeah. There's some pretty strong arguments for a close connection, like A.E. Taylor. He thought Plato's dialogue to Timaeus was heavily influenced by Pythagorean ideas. And then there were these more recent arguments based on counting the lines in Plato's dialogues and looking for patterns related to musical ratios. The idea is that there's this hidden Pythagorean structure to his writing.
That's pretty wild. But our source does say that those line counting arguments have some problems, and there's not much evidence from ancient times to support them.
Yeah, they're controversial, to say the least.
Hmm.
On the other side, you have a lot of Plato scholars today who think the Pythagorean influence was pretty limited. I mean, Plato doesn't actually mention Pythagoras or Pythagoreans that often in his writings. And when Aristotle talks about Plato following these men, he's probably talking about the pre-Socratic philosophers in general, not just the Pythagoreans. Right. It seems like the strongest connection is in Plato's later work on metaphysics. There's a clear link between the Pythagorean ideas of limit and unlimited and Plato's own concept of the one and the indefinite dyad. And even Aristotle said that this is a Pythagorean idea.
So some specific ideas from the Pythagoreans, but not his whole system.
Exactly. And even in areas where there might be Pythagorean influence, like cosmology, there are important differences. Like, Archytas thought the universe was unlimited, while Plato thought it was limited.
Different visions of the cosmos.
Yeah, so it's complicated. Plato definitely knew about and used some Pythagorean ideas, especially in his later works. But he wasn't just a Pythagorean in disguise.
Okay, so the early Pythagoreans are kind of fading away. Plato's influence is debated, and then comes this whole new movement, Neo-Pythagoreanism. And our source says this is actually the most influential version of Pythagoreanism. So what was that all about?
Yeah, Neo-Pythagoreanism, that's a whole other chapter.
Yeah.
It wasn't a single school or anything, but more like a general trend that lasted for centuries. And the basic idea was that Pythagoras was the ultimate source of all Greek philosophy.
Whoa.
Yeah. They even said he got secret wisdom from all these wise men from the East, like Persian magi, Hebrew prophets, even Egyptian priests. They were basically trying to make him into this super sage, the wisest man who ever lived.
So in their view, everyone else, even Plato and Aristotle, were just building on what Pythagoras had already figured out.
Exactly. And to make their case, they started creating all these fake writings, pretending they were by Pythagoras or his early followers.
Fake writings.
Yeah, forgeries. And these fakes were supposed to show that the Pythagoreans had already come up with all the big ideas of Plato and Aristotle, even though they lived way earlier. They'd write these things in the Doric dialect, like the people from southern Italy, but then they'd use all this terminology from Plato and Aristotle. It's like they were trying to rewrite history to make Pythagoras look even more important.
Like historical fan fiction.
Laughing.
Yeah.
Kind of. And they weren't even trying to be subtle about it. They were just putting Platonic and Aristotelian ideas straight into the mouths of supposed Pythagoreans. And sometimes they'd even use these fakes to support their own interpretations of Plato, claiming that, this is what the original Pythagoreans believed, so this is how we should understand Plato. But the funny thing is, most of these forgeries have very little to do with what we know about actual early Pythagoreanism.
Just using the name for their own purposes.
Yeah. Our source mentions this interesting theory that all these forgeries started popping up because of Aristotle's esoteric writings. You see, those writings showed that Plato got some of his key ideas, like the one and the indefinite dyad from the Pythagoreans. But some people might have misinterpreted that as saying that Plato was basically a Pythagorean, which then led them to create all these fake writings to try and prove it.
So, trying to fill in the gaps in the historical record, even if it wasn't true.
Exactly.
Mhm.
And even Timaeus of Locri, who was Plato's Pythagorean character in the Timaeus dialogue, he became a popular target for these forgeries. They'd write all these things and pretend they were by him
And people actually believed these fakes?
for a long time, yeah. But there were some people back then who were skeptical too. But there's this scholar, Centrone, who thinks that a lot of these forgeries were actually part of a bigger project, probably in Alexandria in the first century BCE or CE. He says they were trying to create a whole system of philosophy based on God and the limited and unlimited as form and matter, kind of similar to what the Platonist Eudorus was doing.
So, a more organized effort to promote a particular kind of Pythagorean philosophy.
Exactly. Now, how does all this connect to Neoplatonism? Well, by the 2nd century CE, you have thinkers like Numenius, and they're making a clear link. Numenius said he was going back to the original teachings of Plato and the early Academy, and he believed that all of that came from Pythagoras. He even thought Socrates was a Pythagorean. And he tried to connect Pythagoreanism with wisdom traditions from the East. And then there's Hippolytus. He was trying to refute all these different heresies, and he actually grouped Pythagoras, Plato, Empedocles, and Heraclitus together as part of this Pythagorean lineage. He even said that both Platonism and Pythagoreanism came from Egypt.
So, by this point, Pythagoreanism was becoming a big influence on how people understood other philosophical schools.
Yeah, it was spreading its tentacles everywhere. And then you have Nicomachus of Gerasa in the 2nd century CE. He was really focused on math, and he wrote these books that became very popular, like the Introduction to Arithmetic and the Handbook of Music. He's the one who told that famous story about Pythagoras figuring out musical ratios by listening to blacksmiths hammering.
Oh, yeah, I've heard that one.
It's a great story, but it probably isn't true. Nicomachus's understanding of music theory wasn't actually that sophisticated. He was more interested in fitting things into the Neo-Pythagorean worldview and getting the history right. He even wrote a book called The Theology of Arithmetic that connected pagan gods with numbers. And he wrote a biography of Pythagoras too, but that's lost now.
So, more myth making than historical accuracy.
Pretty much. Now, Plotinus, the founder of Neoplatonism, he was definitely influenced by some Neo-Pythagorean ideas, but he didn't think Pythagoras was the most important figure or anything. The first complete biography of Pythagoras that we still have is by Diogenes Laertius around 200 CE. It's not as heavily influenced by Neo-Pythagoreanism, and it uses a lot of different sources. But then you have Porphyry, Plotinus' student, and his Life of Pythagoras. And that's where you really see Pythagoras as this divinely inspired sage connected to religious mysteries. That was a common idea in Middle Platonism.
So, back to the wise man image.
Yeah. And then there's Iamblichus, who we talked about before. He took all this to a whole new level. He basically tried to merge Neoplatonism with Pythagoreanism in his book on Pythagoreanism. And his On the Pythagorean Life is like this big collection of everything about Pythagoras, but it doesn't always tell you where he got his information from. He was really into numerology and math, and some people even think he was trying to make Pythagoras into a pagan rival to Jesus.
Wow, a philosophical battle of the titans.
Yeah. And all of this Neo-Pythagorean stuff had a big impact on the Romans, too. Cicero really admired Pythagoras and Archytas for their morals, but Pythagoreanism didn't really influence his own philosophy that much, except for maybe the dream of Scipio.
Yeah.
And then you have Roman poets like Horace and Propertius who wrote about Archytas as this great astronomer. Ovid even has Pythagoras giving a speech in his Metamorphoses, talking about vegetarianism and reincarnation. But he mixes in ideas from other Greek philosophers, too.
So, a bit of a mishmash.
Yeah. But the Romans really liked the idea that Pythagoras was connected to Italy. They even had this story about how Rome chose Pythagoras as the wisest Greek. And Cicero said that the Samnites, who were from Italy, got their wisdom from Archytas. There was even this claim that a Roman family, the Amuli, were descended from Pythagoras.
So, trying to claim him as one of their own.
Exactly. And then there's Nigidius Figulus in the 1st century BCE. Cicero said he was the one who brought Pythagoreanism back to life in Rome. Though there's evidence that Romans were interested in Pythagoras even before that. Alexander Polyhistor wrote about Pythagorean symbols and philosophy, and he might have influenced Nigidius and Ovid. And then there's Philostratus' Life of Apollonius of Tyana, which is all about this guy who modeled his whole life on Pythagoras. He was like a Neo-Pythagorean superhero.
So, the Romans loved the Neo-Pythagorean image of Pythagoras as this moral and spiritual role model.
Yeah, that really appealed to them. And that Neo-Pythagorean version of Pythagoras, it had a huge influence on the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, too. People saw him as this giant of Greek philosophy, thanks to all those Neo-Pythagorean writings. And medieval thinkers like Chalcidius and Macrobius, they shaped how people understood Pythagorean cosmology and the soul. They even thought Plato's Timaeus was basically a Pythagorean text.
So the Neo-Pythagorean interpretation was becoming the standard view.
Yeah, pretty much. And all these sayings attributed to Pythagoras, they were really popular. They even showed up in collections of Aristotelian riddles.
Ah.
And the Arabic world loved this version of Pythagoras, too. They said he brought Eastern wisdom to the Greeks and had visions of heaven. The golden verses were a big hit in the Arabic tradition. And they often saw Pythagoras as a kind of early Neoplatonist. Even Nicomachus's math book was translated into Arabic.
So crossing cultural boundaries, too.
And then, in the Renaissance, when there was this big revival of classical learning, Pythagoras was right at the center of it. Marsilio Ficino, who was a big Neoplatonist, he thought Plato was carrying on this ancient wisdom tradition that went all the way back to Pythagoras. He even translated all those pseudo-Pythagorean writings, and he thought they were genuine.
Wow.
Yeah. And other Renaissance thinkers like Pico della Mirandola used Pythagorean ideas about harmony, numbers, Orphic theology, and even the Kabbalah. And in popular culture, you had things like the Wheel of Pythagoras, which was a fortune-telling device, and everyone knew Ovid's version of Pythagoras from the Metamorphoses, even though it wasn't totally accurate.
So this Neo-Pythagorean Pythagoras, he was everywhere.
Absolutely. So we've gone on this whole journey through Pythagoreanism, from its beginnings with Pythagoras and his ideas about reincarnation to the so-called Pythagoreans and their focus on numbers and cosmology. We talked about how hard it is to know for sure who was a Pythagorean and about the mysterious connection with Orphism, and then we saw how the Akismatici and the Mathematici split the tradition in two, and how Neo-Pythagoreanism took over and shaped how people understood Pythagoras for centuries.
Yeah, what an amazing story. And I think for you, as someone who's really into philosophy, it raises some really deep questions. Like, what does this tell us about how philosophical traditions are created and passed down? How do ideas change over time? And how do we even know what someone truly believed, especially someone who lived so long ago?
Exactly. And here's a really thought-provoking question for you to ponder. Given how influential Neo-Pythagoreanism was, is it possible that even some of the most basic ideas in Western philosophy are actually shaped by that interpretation of Pythagoras rather than by the original Pythagoreans? I mean, what would a truly de-Neo-Pythagoreanized philosophy even look like? And how would that change our understanding of the world today?
Whoa, that's a big one. I'm gonna have to think about that.
Me too. It's a question worth exploring.